I've got a trivia question for all of you old-timers out there like me. And here's the question. What was the #1 song on the Billboard magazine Top 100 in 1965? Tough one, huh? The top song in 1965. If you believe it is What the World Needs Now is Love, Sweet Love by Jackie DeShannon, you would be wrong. That was number 63 in the top 100 in 1965. Number 63. But it's one that I remember very well, especially the Dionne Warwick version. No, the #1 song in 1965 was Wooly Bully by Sam the Sham and the Pharaohs. Actually, I think it would have been better if they had chosen Jackie DeShannon's song as the #1 song in 1965. What the world needs now is love, sweet love. Hey, let's sing that song together, shall we? What the world needs now, come on, join me, is love, sweet love. No, we're not going to sing that song. But I do like the lyrics of that song. What the world needs now is love, sweet love. It's the only thing that there's just too little of. What the world needs now is love, sweet love. No, not just for some, but for everyone. Aren't those great lyrics? Well, that's what we need in our world. We need love. More love, the kind of unselfish, unconditional goodwill that the New Testament talks about. Hey, did you know that James talks about love in his letter? I think that's the theme of chapter 2, verses 1 through 13. And James has a lot to tell us in those verses about the law of love. Now, I'm going to talk about that in the next few minutes, and I hope that you'll stay with me all the way through to the very end. I don't intend to talk for too long, so please stay with me. Why? Because I think this is a message from James that we need to hear today. I think we desperately need to hear this in our churches, that we need to show love in our communities and in our churches. So, what does James tell us about the law of love in chapter 2, verses 1 through 13? Number 1. He tells us that this law commands us to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. Yeah, that's verse 8. You do well if you really fulfill the royal law according to the Scripture. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now that's a quotation from Leviticus chapter 19, but you know that James is not the only one who has talked about this particular law. You might remember that it was Jesus who mentioned this, and it could be that James is pulling these words straight from the lips of our Lord. You remember when a lawyer came to test Jesus and he asked him, what was the greatest command? I'm in Matthew chapter 22. And what did Jesus say? The greatest command is that you love God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And the second commandment, or the second greatest commandment, is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And then he went on to say that all of the law and the prophets hang on these two commands. Now, don't you find that interesting? Jesus says there are two great commands, and all 614 laws of the Old Testament can be summarized in these two commands. Love God and love people. I'm so glad that Jesus simplifies that for us. Because really, if we would just consider what it means to love God and what it means to love people, we would please our Father in heaven, no doubt about it. Now, all of the Bible is devoted to giving us the details on what it means to love God and what it means to love your neighbor. Think, for example, of the Ten Commandments, where Moses tells us that the way to love God is to worship Him alone and to not have any idols and to never take His name in vain and to remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And then he says, these are ways that you show your love for people. You honor your parents. You don't steal from your neighbor. You don't commit adultery against your neighbor. You don't bear false witness. You don't covet what belongs to your neighbor. Yes, all the Bible is devoted to explaining to us how we show love for God and love for people. But you know something? I'm really glad that both Jesus and James simplifies it for us. The second greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as you love yourself. And James says this is the royal law. That is, this is the supreme law. Loving the people around us is the supreme royal law. Okay. Now, the second thing in this passage that I see James telling us about the law of love is that we fulfill this law when we show mercy and kindness to the people around us and when we show respect for all. I want to start in verse 13, where James talks about mercy. Judgment will be without mercy to anyone who has shown no mercy. In this passage, James wants us to show mercy to the people around us. Now, this ties in very well with chapter 1, verse 27, doesn't it? Here are two groups of people who deserve our mercy and our kindness: widows and orphans. Two potentially exploited groups in James's day and even in our own day. Hey, the people around us who are in need, James says, I want to encourage you to show kindness to those people, whether they are orphans or widows or anyone else in need. Show mercy to those people. Does that remind you of a story that Jesus once told in Luke chapter 10? That's right, it's the story of the Good Samaritan. And you probably know the story well. A man was traveling from Jericho to Jerusalem, and he fell among thieves and robbers, and what did they do? They beat him and left him for dead. Two religious types passed by without offering to help. But one man came by and said, I've got to help this man in my need. And of all things, he was a Samaritan. And the text tells us that this man poured oil in his wounds and then bandaged his wounds, put the man on his own donkey, took him to an inn, told the innkeeper to take care of him, and that when he returned from his travels, he would pay the innkeeper whatever it had cost to care for him. And then you remember that Jesus turns to the man that he's talking with after telling the story, and he says, now, who do you think was the neighbor to this man in need? And the man responded, I suppose, he couldn't help it, it was obvious, I suppose the man who showed him mercy. That's right. Anyone in need is our neighbor. And our obligation to that person in need is to give him mercy and give him help. James is encouraging us to help those who need us in this passage. I really think that what we ought to do here is to think about those people in our churches and in our communities who need our help. People to whom we may show a kindness. And I think maybe what we ought to do is start with a needs assessment in our churches and in our communities, and then do a little outside of the box thinking about how we might respond to them. It might be that we would meet the needs of widows and orphans. It might also be that we might meet the needs of immigrants who come to this country and who need help in acculturating or who need to learn a new language. It may be that we might need to help college students who are away from home and away from friends and family and who need some special attention during these formative years, or that we would help teenagers, or that we would help the aged. We ought to do a needs assessment and come up with an idea of how we might help these people in our communities who have some special needs. But let's go on to this second group that I talked about. James is saying that we obey the law of love when we respect all. Now, you know from your study of this text that there was a specific problem in the church or churches to whom James writes. And what was that problem? Well, they were showing favoritism to the rich and had disdain for the poor. That is, they were guilty of discrimination. They would say to the rich who came to their assemblies, "Hey, it's good to see you. Glad you came this morning. Why don't you come sit on the front row in these seats of honor? We're so glad you're here." And then to the poor who would come in the door, they would say, "Why don't you get in the back and stand up? Or better yet, sit down there on the floor at my feet." It was an insult. James says you ought not to be discriminating against the poor, and you ought not to be showing favoritism to the rich, because when you do that, you're showing that you're not obeying the law of love that says to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, we may or may not be guilty of showing favoritism to the rich and discriminating against the poor. It could be that we discriminate against the rich and show favoritism to the poor. I wish class warfare would come to an end in this country, don't you? It could be, though, that we are showing discrimination in other ways. Are we discriminating against the educated in our churches and showing favoritism to the uneducated? Or are we guilty of doing the opposite, showing favoritism to the educated while not giving any regard at all to those who may have little education? I think I have seen in some churches what I thought was discrimination against those who were older. We call that ageism in this country, don't we? In essence, we say to those who are older, your time has come and gone. You no longer have anything to contribute to the work of the church here, so we want you to take this back seat. Well, you're just waiting to die. We don't want you to have any input. Instead, we show favoritism to the younger ones. I also think I've seen in some churches what I thought was discrimination against younger people. Hey, your time is not here yet. You don't have any worthwhile input to provide into the affairs and the goings-on of this particular body of Christ, so you just wait your turn. We don't want to hear from you. Discrimination can come in all kinds of forms, can't it? But are these forms of discrimination against the educated or the uneducated, against the older members or the younger members, are these forms of discrimination any less heinous than the kind of discrimination that was going on in the congregations to whom James writes? I don't think so, and you don't either. When we discriminate against anyone, we're not showing respect for those people. And when we disrespect anyone, we're not obeying the law of love that says that we should love our neighbor as we love ourselves. That's the second thing that I see James telling us in this passage. We fulfill this law of love when we show mercy and kindness to those around us and when we demonstrate respect for everyone. But there's a third truth in this passage that I want to bring to our attention, and honestly, it's the one that is like a 2x4 upside my head. When I read verse 12, it was like James was telling me exactly what I needed to hear. Here's verse 12. So speak and so act as those who are to be judged by the law of liberty. We might say then that James is telling us that this is the law of love, by which we will be judged. Now, how do you feel about that? James says we're going to be judged by this law. The standard by which God measures our religiosity, our spirituality will be, did he or she love the people around them? Did they demonstrate this law of love? Did they love their neighbors as they love themselves? And again, that's a sobering thought for me. You know, I know that it's not popular to talk about judgment, and it's certainly not popular to be negative in a sermon, but verse 12 is both of those, in my opinion. We're going to be judged by this law. A very sobering thought. Now, I think we need to hear this, and this is why I ask you to stay with me all the way through to the end of this message, because I think this is a message that we really do need to hear. Because what James is telling us is that this is the basis upon which God will judge us. Did we obey the second commandment? I'm thinking, however, that a lot of us feel that we're going to be judged almost entirely upon whether or not we believed the truth, or whether or not we held fast to correct and sound doctrine. Now, I'm not against sound doctrine. I'm not against the truth or correct doctrine. Hey, correct doctrine is important. Why? Because it leads to correct behavior. If our doctrine is messed up, our behavior is going to be messed up. If we believe it's okay to lie, how's that going to affect our relationships? If we believe it's okay for us to cheat on our spouse and commit adultery with our neighbor or with our neighbor's spouse, how's that going to affect our relationship with our spouse, with our family, with our neighbor? You see, right doctrine leads to right behavior. Correct doctrine leads to correct behavior. So we're not going to diss or criticize correct doctrine. But what I'm saying is, we're going to be judged upon the basis of how we behave and how we live and how we treat those people around us. Yes, we need to believe the right things, and our doctrine needs to be true and correct. But it's not enough unless that correct doctrine leads to correct behavior. And so you see the importance of verse 12 here in chapter 2. God's going to judge me on the basis of how I treat the people around me. Did I show mercy and kindness? Did I show respect for all? That's sobering to me. Sobering to me. All right. There are just a few things that James tells us about the law of love in chapter 2. It's a law that commands us to love our neighbors. We fulfill this law when we show mercy and kindness to those around us and when we have respect for all. And this is the law by which we will be judged. I want to close this brief message with a story that I heard long ago that continues to have a great impact upon me. In fact, I've used it in probably more than one post at connect3ministries.com. And it's the story of Ira North, the preacher for the great Madison Church of Christ in Madison, Tennessee. That was a church of 25, 30 years ago that was known for their benevolence. Everybody in the community knew about the mercy and the kindness and the good works that church showed to people in need. And the story is told by Ira that one day, one Saturday, he was at the office, the church building office, preparing for his sermon on Sunday morning, when he heard a knock at the front door. And when he went to the front door, there were two African-American boys asking to come in. He opened the door to them, and then those two boys asked him this question: "Sir, is this the church what helps people?" And you can imagine Ira flashing that gap-toothed grin of his and saying, "You know, it's interesting, boys. You could have gone to several churches today, but you did come to the church what helps people." I love that story because it reminds me again that our religion must extend beyond holding fast to the correct doctrine. It must make a difference in the way we treat people. And I'm wondering today, what would happen if our churches were known as churches what helped people? What impact we would have upon our world and upon society if this is how we were known. This is the church that helps people. You have needs, we're here to help. You need kindness shown to you, we're the ones you want to meet. We respect everyone and we care for everyone and we're here to help. I think it'd be great if we were known as those kind of people. Well, there's the message. I don't want you to turn off this audio and say, "Well, Kerry, that was a great message. Thank you very much. I enjoyed that. It hit me right." No, I don't want you to say those things. I want you to do something about this message. I want you to go into your churches and say, what can we do to help people around us? What can we do? Let's think outside of the box. What are the needs that people have that we can meet and satisfy? Will you do that? Think about how you can put this message from James chapter 2, verses 1 through 13 into practice. Don't let it go in one ear and out the other. And may God bless us as we try to obey His word.